The winter had cracked the earth into splinters. Frost laced the air with needles, and the village had been emptied by famine long before the soldiers arrived. They didn't come with fire or arrows, just slow, patient steps, like they were, sweeping dust from the floor. Livia had stopped crying 2 days before. She watched her sister's body shrink in the corner of the barn, a fly-blown ghost. The soldiers found her alone, curled beside a broken jar of oats. The one with the red cloak didn't speak when he grabbed her wrist. She didn't resist. No one did anymore. Hunger had stripped rebellion from her bones. They marched her south, through villages just as dead, then across a mountain pass to the castle, whose towers cut the sky like broken teeth. When the gates opened, the warmth inside should have felt like mercy. It didn't. Inside the court, the smell of rose oil masked the rot beneath the tapestries. Livia blinked at the brightness walls of colored glass, polished marble floors slick beneath her blistered feet. She didn't understand the whispers at first. They circled her like moths around an open flame. She looks like her. The eyes, perhaps, ... The chin is right. A man in silver robes stepped forward. He leaned close, inspecting her face with the cold calculation of someone assessing a corpse. He turned to the dais. The king sat motionless, cloaked in black, fingers tangled in a velvet sash, embroidered with gold sigils. His eyes were sunk deep behind shadows. He rose slowly and descended the steps. His boots echoed on the stones until he stood before her. She dared not lift her gaze. A single finger brushed her chin, lifting it. His face didn't change. She returns, he murmured, not to her, but to the silence. That night, they shaved her head and scrubbed her until her skin bled. They poured scented oils over her scalp, dressed her in stiff brocade with a high collar and tight sleeves. The colors of the royal family. Every mark of who she had been was removed, burned, or buried. When they painted her lips and braided pearls into a new wig, she caught a glimpse of her reflection. She did not know the girl in the mirror. They told her the name she would now answer to, Illyria. They spoke it with reverence and fear. The real Illyria had been the king's daughter, firstborn, beloved, lost 5 winters ago to illness or poisoning, depending on which servant whispered the tale. No one spoke of her directly, but her portrait still hung in the great hall, solemn, delicate, dressed like a bride carved from alabaster. Livia had the same sharp cheekbones, the same gray eyes. That was all it took. The high priest declared it a sign from the heavens. The kingdom had suffered famine, plague, and endless border raid since Illyria's death. But now, he claimed, the old gods, or the saints, had returned her in a new vessel. To question the miracle would be treason. They didn't need her to understand. They needed her to obey. She learned the scripts, how Illyria walked, where she rested her hands during ceremonies, what psalms she sang at dusk. Every motion drilled into her until muscle remembered what her mind could not. A mistake brought punishment. Cold water baths, kneeling for hours on stone, meat withheld from supper. A smirk from a chambermaid was enough to spiral her into doubt. She wasn't allowed to laugh. Illyria had never laughed in public. The king visited her chamber after evening prayers. He never touched her. He simply sat beside the fire and watched. Her brush, her hair. Sometimes he spoke, not to her, but to someone she could not see. "You are always quiet when you read," he'd say, and she would nod, unsure whether to answer. She learned not to ask questions. One had slipped once. She asked who had taught Illyria to read. The silence that followed pressed so heavy. She thought her lungs might collapse. Weeks passed. She began to forget her own name. It didn't appear in any ledger. The servants called her, "My lady." The courtiers bowed. Her face was sewn into embroidery gifts from foreign guests. She signed proclamations she could not read. In every chapel, They lit candles for Illyria's return. The people in the city whispered that she had risen from the grave to forgive them. Mothers brought sick children to the gates, hoping for her gaze. One morning, she found herself reaching for a quill and signing the name without thinking. She dropped it, horrified. Her hands no longer shook when the king entered the room. The priest blessed her forehead with holy oil and said the kingdom had turned a corner. Her very breath was proof of divine favor. She lay awake that night, tracing the lines of her palms. Once they told her she had healing hands when she had tended to her sister's fever. That memory felt like someone else's now. Her hands belonged to Illyria. The food she ate belonged to Illyria. The breath in her lungs was borrowed. If she cried, she did it silently, not because she was afraid, but because even her grief might be seen as unworthy of the queen they had lost. One afternoon, during a feast for the harvest gods, the king raised a goblet and called her his daughter reborn. Livia looked at the sea of smiling faces, the torches burning bright, the wine flowing like blood. No one saw the girl they had taken, only the shadow they believed had returned. Her hands were stained with pomegranate juice. Her throat burned from swallowing a name that was never hers. She realized then, there would be no going back. No field, no sister, no truth, only the role, only the ghost. The walls sweated with mold, no matter how many tapestries they hung. Beneath the perfumes and incense, rot lingered in every breath. Each morning, Livia was woken before the sun by a bell dragged through the halls by a limping boy. She rose in silence. Any protest would earn her salt on the tongue, or worse, confinement in the damp root cellar, until her voice returned to obedience. The day began with purification. She stood naked as the handmaidens scrubbed her down with cloths soaked in vinegar. They whispered hymns while they worked, as if her skin might absorb sanctity through repetition. After the bath, she was laced into stiff bodices and gowns, tailored to match the queen's likeness. They powdered her skin pale, painted her mouth red. The wig was pinned so tight it left her scalp bleeding some days. Each detail was enforced by memory, not hers, but theirs. She ate little. Meals were ritual, not sustenance. A few berries, a slice of cheese, sometimes broth if the priest allowed it. They said excess dulled the spirit. Hunger, they claimed, kept her close to the divine. Once, she reached for a fig without permission. The priest saw. She bled from the knees that night, ordered to pray until dawn. She was never alone. Even in sleep, a maid kept watch. Her chamber was arranged exactly as Queen Illyria's had been, down to the ivory combs and the bowl with blue glaze that held dried roses. She was not permitted to touch anything that had not belonged to the real queen. The past was a prison she was shackled to piece by piece. Servants passed her in silence, eyes downcast. Some bowed too deeply, others refused to meet her gaze at all. Behind the tapestries, they whispered that she was cursed, a shadow sewn into flesh. Some feared her, others pitied her. None dared speak her real name. To do so was treason. To remember who she had been was rebellion. A young boy, mute from birth, was assigned to serve her privately. He had seen Illyria once, years ago, before the sickness. He knew her movements well enough to teach Livia how to mimic them. A tilt of the head, a glance over the shoulder, the way her fingers traced the rim of her cup. He pointed, gestured, corrected. He couldn't speak, but his silence was kinder than the priest's lectures, or the noble women's cold smiles. Livia trusted him. He never flinched when she slipped, only gently pushed her back into form. The court rarely allowed her beyond the inner gardens. Once or twice, she glimpsed the outer gate soldiers, sharpening blades, peasants, kneeling in mud. She longed to speak with one, to ask what they saw when they looked at her. But no one addressed her directly, unless spoken to. Even then, they used phrases like, "Your grace has returned." Never a question, only declarations. One of the king's advisors began bringing her petitions, requests from villagers for blessings, justice, mercy. She was told to trace her name on them, to nod or shake her head in response to their stories. She did not understand the language fully, but that was never the point. Her presence validated their suffering, made it palatable. If she wept, they praised her compassion. If she remained still, they whispered of divine resolve. Illness circled the castle. A cough in the kitchens, red boils in the stables. Servants disappeared and did not return. The priest claimed it was a test sent by the heavens to prove her endurance. She was made to fast longer, sleep on straw, cleanse her hands in bitter herbs each morning. No one touched her bare skin anymore. She was becoming less a girl and more a holy image. Her body still breathed, but everything human was stripped away. Once, during an inspection by a visiting archbishop, a girl around Livia's age approached in the chapel courtyard. Her dress was too thin for the season, her face smudged with soot. She knelt and kissed Livia's slippered foot. The guards didn't stop her. They stood still, hands on swords, watching. The girl whispered, "They said you came back. I prayed you would." Livia opened her mouth, but the priest's voice cut through before she could speak. "She hears your devotion. Now go." The girl was dragged away. That night, Livia dreamed of the barn where her sister died. She saw the flies again, the cracked oat jar, the sun bleeding through broken slats. When she woke, she tried to hum a lullaby she once knew, but her voice cracked. The song had faded. Her reflection became unfamiliar. The queen's gowns, the ceremonial jewelry, the inked and beauty marks all masked her. She had learned to stand still for hours during ceremonies, to allow priests to anoint her with ash and myrrh. Once, they laid a silver circlet on her head and called her the kingdom's savior. She wanted to scream, to tear the dress, to shout her name, but she bowed her head and smiled. The pain in her jaw from holding still reminded her she was still flesh beneath the porcelain mask. The mute boy gave her a carved figure one night, a wooden bird with rough wings. He held it out and pressed it into her hand. It was not part of the queen's relics. It had no royal story. It was his. For a moment, she held something that belonged only to now, not memory. But a maid saw it the next morning and confiscated it. Later that evening, she found it burned in the fireplace. Livia understood the message. She could not possess anything her predecessor had not touched. Even kindness was forbidden unless it came through ritual. When the bells rang for evening procession, she moved without thought. Her limbs carried her where they must. She chanted the prayers, lit the candles, received the blessings. The robes scratched at her skin. She did not flinch. Her breath matched the rhythm of the choir. The queen lived through her. That was what they believed. And so she survived, not by being herself, but by vanishing slowly, inch by inch, into someone who had long been dead. The palace grew quieter as the sickness spread. First the kitchen staff, then the stable hands, then the steward who oversaw the chapel ceremonies. The corridors, once filled with servants and steps, were now hushed, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every day, more rooms were sealed. Livia noticed how the eyes of the guards no longer bowed but lingered. Reverence was thinning, and something darker replaced it. The king had become withdrawn, appearing only during key rituals, his face pallid and strained. His voice, once thunderous with command, cracked when he spoke to her. There were moments he didn't seem to recognize her. He would call her by a name that wasn't hers, Illyria, of course, but sometimes it sounded like he was speaking to the real one. One evening, he pressed a ring into her hand, the same ring said to have belonged to the late queen. "You wore this when you recited the old hymns," he said, trembling. She nodded, though she had never seen it before. Her resemblance had begun to fade. She had grown taller, her voice deepened slightly with age, and her cheeks no longer held the roundness of a child. The handmaidens added thicker powder to conceal the change. The priest brought rare oils to coat her face and cover signs of fatigue. They whispered that the body might be aging, but the spirit remained untouched. The illusion had to be preserved. The rituals grew stranger. One involved her kneeling beside the king, their wrists tied together by a crimson cord, as he spoke vows meant for a bloodline ceremony. She didn't fully understand the words, but she understood the meaning in his stare. The priest called it an act of ancestral healing. That night, she refused to enter the throne chamber. She locked herself in her quarters and refused food. The next morning the guards broke the lock and dragged her to the chapel. They called it penance. She was forced to kneel on cold stone for 3 days, given only water and silence. On the second night, she collapsed. When she woke, her wrists were bound to a prayer bench, and the priest stood over her, chanting purification verses. He smeared ash across her chest, whispering of disobedience, impurity, divine correction. She said nothing. Even her thoughts felt like blasphemy. The mute boy tried to intervene. He left an offering on her pillow, an old ribbon she had once dropped months ago. But the maids found it, and when the king was informed, the boy was taken. Livia wasn't told where. Days passed, then weeks. The boy did not return. No one spoke of him. She asked once, and the priest said only, "Some bonds must be severed, so the divine can work through you." Rumors drifted through the palace like smoke. The outer villages were in revolt. Bandits had taken 3 grain stores. A noble family had fled across the mountains. Still, the ceremonies continued. The people were told the queen's presence was keeping the plague from consuming the city. She became a symbol of stability in a world unraveling, but behind the image, she was breaking. One night, the king demanded a private prayer ceremony with her. She was summoned without warning, wrapped in ceremonial robes, and led through the back corridors of the chapel. He sat alone before the altar, hands shaking, eyes red. As she entered, he rose and approached, but there was no recognition in his gaze. He called her my salvation and touched her face. She flinched. He stopped, visibly wounded, then gestured to the priest. The priest recited a binding prayer, a vow of closeness between monarch and heir, meant to ensure unity in the bloodline. Livia tried to speak, to protest, but her voice cracked. The king took her silence as consent. She was made to kneel beside him while candles burned down to stubs. She felt nothing but cold. Afterwards, she did not return to her usual chamber. She was locked instead in a smaller bare room near the tower. A plate of bread and water was left outside the door once a day. She had become a threat, unpredictable, too aware. Her role had shifted. No longer just an illusion, she was now a liability that needed managing. Days blurred. The stone floor bruised her skin. Rats crept through the cracks. Her fingers bled from clawing at the door. She stopped calling out after the second week. She counted time by the sliver of light under the door. Sleep came in fragments. Memories from before the castle returned without warning her sisters. The texture of oat husks on her skin, a cradle song her mother once sang. They became more vivid than her life inside the walls. One night, a monk entered, carrying a sealed parchment. He read a decree. She was to be moved to the chapel of a remote sanctuary, for those whose divine fire must be shielded from the world. She would live in silence among other castaways of the court. The explanation was wrapped in religious justification, but the truth was clear. She was being discarded. They dressed her in plain robes, shaved her head again, and walked her out, through the side gate before dawn. No announcement was made. No farewell. The queen had vanished quietly, as all illusions eventually do when they stop serving their purpose. Asterisk, as she rode through the gray countryside, she watched the fog swallow the castle spires. No one knew who she had once been, and no one would ask. To the kingdom, she had been Illyria. To herself, she had been no one. Now, even that was taken. Asterisk, she did not cry. There was no grief left to spend. Asterisk, the chapel of ashes stood beyond the river that marked the end of the king's land. It was not built to be seen. No towers, no stained glass, no procession. Just stone and shadow, surrounded by fields choked with weeds. Inside, the air never warmed. The walls sweated salt, and the cold came from within, not from the season. Livia arrived without ceremony, her head bowed, her robe damp with morning frost. No one spoke to her as she was led through a narrow hall to a cell the size of a grave. Asterisk, she was not the only one. The other women were silent, bent like trees in permanent wind. Some had been there for years, their voices long gone. They moved in patterns, cleaning the altar, tending the herb beds, scrubbing floors that never stayed clean. No names were used, only signs and glances. The rules were few and absolute. Silence, obedience, prayer. The rest was endurance. Asterisk, she slept on straw, woke at the bell, ate whatever thin broth was given, and worked without question. The days were measured by tasks, not meaning. Time blurred. Sometimes she imagined the king had died, the castle burned, the court vanished, but no word reached them. Only the bells tolled from the tower when another sister died and was buried behind the chapel wall with no marker. Asterisk, in her silence, Livia remembered more than she wished. The sound of her sister breathing at night, the warmth of sun on bare skin. Her name, once spoken with love, now reduced to a whisper in her own thoughts. She repeated it silently before sleep, as if saying it aloud in her mind might keep it alive. Months passed. Her hair grew uneven. Her hands became calloused. Her face no longer matched the paintings that once hung in palace halls. She saw her reflection in a cracked mirror once, and barely recognized the eyes that looked back. There was no fear, only a quiet absence. She had become invisible. Asterisk, a fever swept through the chapel. It started with the older ones, a shaking cough that bled into the lungs. There was no doctor, no remedies. The sisters who fell were wrapped in linen and buried quickly. Livia tended to the sick with the others, holding bowls of water to parched lips, changing soiled blankets, whispering prayers she no longer believed. When her hands touched burning skin, she did not flinch. She waited for the fever to take her to. It never did. She survived again. After the sickness faded, the chapel grew quieter. Only a handful of women remained. The routine continued. One morning, she was told to scrub the walls of the archive room, a stone chamber filled with records too old or too damaged to matter. She moved slowly, wiping dust from scrolls that crumbled under her touch. Near the end of the day, she found a sealed packet marked with a faded royal crest. Inside was a collection of documents, records from the palace, a list of royal rituals, prayers, and at the bottom, a sketch. Asterisk, it was her face, or rather, Illyria's. Delicate lines captured her in profile, the tilt of the chin, the narrowed eyes, but it was signed by the king. Underneath, a note in his own hand. She returned to me in form, but form is not soul. The soul is lost. Asterisk, she folded the page and placed it into the fire. The flame swallowed it whole. Asterisk, later, she sat in the garden where weeds pushed through cracked stones. She looked at her hands, no longer soft, no longer afraid. She wondered if her sister would recognize her now. Perhaps not. That girl had died the moment her name was taken. Asterisk, years passed. No visitors came. No letters arrived. The chapel rotted. One by one, the women faded. She planted herbs that never grew, cleaned floors that never stayed dry, recited prayers that echoed without meaning. No one said her name again. She stopped saying it herself. Asterisk when she finally died, no one marked the day. She was buried behind the chapel wall with the rest. A shallow grave. No stone. Just earth and silence. Asterisk, in the royal records, her name did not exist. The archives made no note of her disappearance. The court spoke of Queen Illyria's miraculous return and her eventual retreat into sacred solitude. A shrine was raised in the king's memory. The city moved on. Wars changed borders. New faces filled the palace halls. Asterisk, no one remembered the girl who had been taken. Not the peasant, not the prisoner, not the shadow in the dress. She was never real to them, only a shape. Asterisk somewhere in the wind that passes through forgotten ruins. There's still the sound of her voice, the one she was never allowed to use. It doesn't ask to be known, only not to be erased again. Asterisk, and in that silence, she endures longer than any crown.